Hello and welcome back to my channel. My name is David Novak. Today's video is going to be a mite esoteric. Recently on the channel of Timothy E.G. Bartell, Knowing Poetry, I learnt of a book under the title A Formal Feeling Comes. The title comes from an Emily Dickinson poem, a formal feel. The nerves sit ceremonious like tombs. I wonder if they give you the quote. You would think they would. After great pain, that was the first part that I was missing. After great pain, a formal feeling comes. The nerves sit ceremonious like tombs. Let me just read you something from the back cover. Celebrating the diverse traditions of poetic form, editor and poet Annie Finch presents illuminating examples from 60 contemporary women poets who have transformed and strengthened their literary inheritance. A Formal Feeling Comes welcomes the new millennium with intellectual clarity, emotional freedom, and a chorus of powerful voices. It is an anthology featuring a goodly number of poets. Let me see what year this is from. Copyright 1994, first American printing. So there are a good number of poets included, and the anthology only includes maybe at best 3 poems by each poet, but each section of poems is preceded by a small meditation upon poetry, often specifically the use of form in poetry. Now, I'm going to read 3 different segments from this by 3 different poets. One of them makes reference to the poetry wars of the 80s, I think it is. I was alive during those wars. I was taking a stand during those wars. After much time, I have come to feel that those wars ultimately revealed themselves to be a lot of sound and fury signifying nothing. Well, perhaps not nothing, but signifying very little. This whole argument between this style of poetry and that, should poetry use these various techniques, rhyme, meter, so forth, or should it not? It ultimately comes down to the poet at hand writing the poem and what the muse has delivered him or her, and how he or she chooses to operate. So it's really no more complicated than that. I'm going to read these 3 sections, not to say that I am making an endorsement, but simply to say that I thought it was interesting. Everybody comes to the practice via his or her own unique avenue. And I find what these poets had to say just very interesting to think upon. So first we have Carolyn Kizer. It's titled A Defense of Breathing. Writing about the iambic pentameter is like writing a defense of breathing. When I was a child, I had severe asthma. I would lie perfectly still and concentrate on the production of the next breath. So I have never since been able to take breathing for granted. It is both the most natural and the most concentrated activity I know. One breath and the pentameter line have the same duration. Sometimes I believe that my students think that the iambic pentameter was thought up by a group of ancient scholars with long beards and imposed on the prosodic canon with malicious intent. Those who don't obey it are not poets. Then one must remind them of the origins of poetry in prayer and dance, rhythmic activities. One of the problems of the modernized services of worship is that the old rhythms are destroyed by a group of men with tin ears who are incapable of substituting a measure to accompany their barbarous alterations. One of the problems with free verse, which I commit occasionally, is that it is damned hard to remember, even as Gary Snyder acknowledges. Memorization, I believe, should go hand in hand with the reading and learning of poems. We can remember short verses like "In a Station of the Metro" and "The Red Wheelbarrow," but a long poem in free verse is virtually impossible to recite accurately. Lacking the chains of epithets which Homer used, all we have to help us is meter and rhyme. I'm not going to read any of the poems by any of these poets. I don't know if the origins of poetry are in prayer and dance. The next is Elizabeth Spires, and this is some notes on form. Despite the poetry wars of the 80s that raged between some of my contemporaries, I have never felt the necessity to choose, in some absolute sense, between form and free verse. Neither have some of the poets of the preceding two generations whom I most admire and who, at one time or another, have been poetic models for my own work. Poets such as Elizabeth Bishop, Anthony Hecht, and W.D. Snodgrass, to name just three. In my own poems, I have always let the early drafts of a poem lead me, when they would, to a fixed rhyme scheme, an approximate line length, a metrical base, or the opposite, free verse lineation, etc., rather than deciding beforehand, the poem unwritten, what form I would work in. Of the three poems reprinted here, Apology is probably the most formal. It is a poem about limits, the unhappy limits of a life, the short set stanzas and line lengths meant to reinforce a sense of confinement. The identical rhymes used in the quatrains culminate, I hope, in a kind of dead-end effect in the last stanza with the poem's final assertion, a song is narrow, a life is narrow. An obsessive circling quality is present in the use of the refrain, who am I like, in Interrogations of the Sparrow. In these poems, the form chosen, I hope, creates a kind of inverted lyric moment, not of praise or affirmation, but of mental and physical entrapment of the speaker. I've probably taken the most liberties with The Comb and the Mirror, a narrative poem that I imagine a poet of a more formal bent would have written as a ballad. Instead, I opted for a 3-beat iambic line with occasional trochaic substitution to give the poem a slightly off-balance, asymmetrical quality. My justification for this resides in the speaker, a mermaid straddling her world of water and the alien world of her human lover. In certain passages, I knew I wanted the phrasing to be slightly unnatural or inverted, the syntax mirroring the mermaid's own awkwardness on land and her pain and ambivalence in retelling the story. My tendency when reading my contemporaries, as well as in reacting to my own students' poems, is to wish that die-hard formalists would sometimes loosen the ties that bind them, and that militant advocates of free verse would occasionally experiment with set forms. To limit ourselves as poets to either form or free verse exclusively is to narrow our expressive possibilities both in terms of what subjects we will write about and how that subject matter will be treated. Personally, I am hoping that the poetry wars of the 1980s have ended and that we can all just settle down and write in the 90s without proscriptions or dogmatism the best poems we are capable of. A fair amount of overthinking going on there, and I don't think that the poems themselves that were alluded to bear up to the kind of scrutiny that the poet herself pretends to give them. Lastly, a poet named Maura Stanton. This is Reflections on Meter. I used to wonder why Shakespeare sounded like Shakespeare and Milton sounded like Milton. I wanted to sound like that too. I wanted to sound like Chaucer and Keats and Dickinson and Frost and Bishop. They all had their own voices, of course, and no one could ever confuse them with one another, but they all had a driving power in their lines of poetry, and it was that power that I wanted. But I also wanted to sound like me. I have a flat Midwestern accent, and instinct told me that I shouldn't try to lose it in order to sound like a fake Elizabethan or fake romantic or fake New Englander. So I studied the mystery of their lines, and it was a surprisingly long time after I'd begun writing poetry that I realized the secret was that they all wrote in meter. Not the textbook meter of abstract feet that turned poetry into algebra, but in the natural stressed meter of the English language that approximated speech. So one day, after years of writing in a controlled free verse that accidentally fell into meter at times, I sat down to deliberately write 100 lines of blank verse. It was a turning point in my life. I felt that I was speaking in my own voice, but that at the same time a deeper force was shaping my lines and giving me a mysterious new entry into my imagination. I read some books after that because I wanted to understand what I was doing. For me, the most useful definition of meter is the one in John Thompson's little book, The Founding of English Meter, Columbia University Press, 1966. Thompson says that meter is made by abstracting from speech one of the essential features of the language, stress, and ordering it into a pattern. The pattern is an imitation of the pattern that stress makes in speech, a sort of formalizing of the pattern. The pattern follows the principles of the language. It's a symbolic model of the way English works. So what's it for? Thompson says meter does for language what the forms of any art do for their materials. It abstracts certain elements from the experience of the senses and forms them into patterns, as painting abstracts elements from what the eye perceives, dancing from what the body perceives as it moves, as fiction abstracts the events of life into a plot. What meter adds to the language is the element of imitation that makes art. When the metrical pattern is placed in conjunction with some words or phrases, a tension exists between them. The meter exerts a pull on the natural sound pattern of the phrases. To abstract the natural stress pattern of English and to juxtapose it against the ordinary American talk of somebody stuck in a particular place or situation is one way of creating meaning in a poem. Not the only way, of course, but for me, it's a way that connects me to the poetry of the past and allows me to dream of the poetry of the future. So that was a very, very personal introspection. I was especially bowled over by the line that that effort at writing the, I think it was blank verse, changed her life. Really startling and stunning. Again, not to say that I endorse anything prescribed, say, in this book, or even what the samplings that I have just read suggest or claim to know about poetry, versification, formalism, yada, yada, yada. But I thought all of them, for the practitioner of verse, was interesting. So thank you for stopping by my channel. I will put a link into the description box to Knowing Poetry, if I can find it, the video in which this book comes up.